She was sold on a Tuesday, married by Wednesday noon, gone by sundown. The whole town of Caldwell Creek watched it happen, and not one soul lifted a finger to stop it. A girl of 20 traded like livestock to settle a dead man's debts. The man who took her wasn't civilized, wasn't gentle, wasn't the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about. He was the kind they didn't even dare name out loud. But here's what nobody in that town understood yet. The monster they feared had just saved her life. If this story grips you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale. The morning her life fell apart, Eliza Hartwell was elbow deep in bread dough. She hadn't slept well. She never slept well anymore. Not since her father had taken sick back in March. Not since the letters started arriving. Thin envelopes with thick threats tucked inside. But that particular Tuesday had felt almost ordinary when she first opened her eyes. The kitchen fire was low but not dead. The smell of pine smoke drifted through the gaps in the cabin walls. Outside, the aspens along the creek had gone gold, and when the wind moved through them, they made a sound like distant applause. She had allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe nothing terrible would happen that day. She was wrong. Eliza. Her mother's voice came from the front room, flat, emptied out. The voice of a woman who had already spent every last bit of hope she had. Eliza pulled her hands from the dough, wiped them on her apron, walked to the doorway. Her mother, Margaret Hartwell, sat rigid in the wooden chair nearest the window, her back so straight it looked painful. She was 52 years old and looked 70. The last 8 months had done that to her. Grief had a way of hollowing people out from the inside, and Margaret had been hollowed thoroughly. Standing across from her, filling the small room with the particular menace of a man who knew his own power and enjoyed it, was Silas Croft. Eliza had hated Silas Croft for as long as she could remember. He was not physically imposing. That was the thing that made him so unsettling. He was of average height, softly built, with small hands and a jaw that receded slightly into his collar. He dressed well. Too well for a frontier town, always in a pressed coat and polished boots that seemed to gather no dust regardless of the season. His hair was dark and oiled back from a wide forehead. He had a smile that he deployed like a weapon, slow and deliberate, arriving on his face at precisely the moments when it was most unwelcome. He was smiling now. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I was just discussing the situation with your mother." "What situation?" Eliza did not phrase it as a question. She already knew. Croft tilted his head slightly, the smile not moving. "Your father borrowed $460 from my lending office, in March, before his unfortunate passing." He paused, letting the pause do its own damage. "The note came due last week." "We know when it came due." "Then you'll also know that I've been remarkably patient." He glanced around the room, at the cracked plaster, the worn floorboards, the curtains that had been mended so many times they were more repair than original cloth. "Remarkably patient, given the circumstances. We'll get you your money." The words came out before Eliza could think them through. Croft's smile finally shifted. Something underneath it surfaced briefly. Not cruelty exactly, but something adjacent. Pleasure, maybe, at the specific texture of her desperation. "With what, my dear?" "Your father left you a cabin, 60 acres of rocky slope, and a milk cow that I'm told has stopped producing." Her mother made a small sound, barely a sound at all. "We could sell the land," Eliza said. "I already hold the lien on the land." He said it gently, like he was informing her of something regrettable, but inevitable, like a late frost. "Your father was not a careful man with his affairs. God rest him." The room went quiet. Through the window, Eliza could see the aspens moving. She focused on them because she did not want to look at her mother's face, and she absolutely could not look at Silas Croft's. "What do you want?" she said. "I want what's owed to me." He let the silence stretch a moment. "Or an arrangement." She looked at him then. She couldn't help it. "Your mother is too old to work off a debt like this. You, however—" He gestured in her direction, a small motion that somehow managed to take inventory of her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You could come work in my household, cooking, managing the domestic affairs. I have need of someone capable." "For how long?" "Until the debt is satisfied, including interest, of course." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small folded paper, unfolded it, set it on the table. "My household accounts are meticulous. I suspect it would take somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 years." 3 to 4 years, in Silas Croft's house, under Silas Croft's roof. Eliza had heard things. Every woman in Caldwell Creek had heard things, traded in low voices when men weren't present. About the widow Hargrove's daughter who'd gone to work for Croft 2 years back and come home 8 months later saying nothing, looking at nothing, walking like something inside her had been quietly broken. About the arrangement Croft had tried to propose to the Fletcher girl before her brothers caught wind of it and ran him off their property with a horsewhip.
"No," Eliza said. Croft blinked. He hadn't expected that. People did not often say no to Silas Croft in his own county. "Miss Hartwell, I said no." Her voice was steady. She was surprised by that. "I'll find another way."
He picked the paper back up, folded it with deliberate care, slid it back into his pocket. "You have until Friday," he said. "After that, I will begin proceedings to seize the property. Your mother will need to vacate." He moved toward the door. "I do hope you'll reconsider. The offer is genuinely generous." He left. The door closed behind him. Eliza stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, not moving, the bread dough drying on her hands. Her mother said very quietly, "Eliza." "Don't!" Eliza pressed her eyes shut. "Just give me a minute." "Matt." She spent the next 3 days trying to find another way. She went to the bank in Caldwell Creek, where the loan officer, a thin man named Pettigrew, who smelled of pipe tobacco, looked at her with something between sympathy and embarrassment and explained that the bank did not issue loans to unmarried women without property collateral, and as she had no property, she attempted to interrupt him here, and he talked over her. She had no collateral and therefore no loan. He said he was very sorry about her father. He did not sound very sorry. She went to their neighbors, the Abbotts, a farming family 3 miles south. Thomas Abbott shook his head with genuine regret. He had his own debts, his own problems, a bad harvest and 2 sick horses and a baby coming in January. He pressed a $10 bill into her hand that she could see he could not afford to give, and the gesture nearly undid her right there in his front yard. She gave it back. She wouldn't do that to a family that couldn't afford it. She asked the minister, the school teacher, and the woman who ran the dry goods store. She wrote a letter to her father's brother in Kansas, knowing even as she sealed the envelope that he had his own 6 children and his own grinding poverty, and that the letter might as well be written to the wind. By Thursday evening, she had exhausted every possibility she could think of and found nothing. She sat on the porch steps as the sun went down and thought about the widow Hargrove's daughter, who walked like something inside her had been broken, and she thought about 3 to 4 years, and she thought about Friday. Her mother sat beside her after a while. They didn't speak. They had gotten past the stage of useful words. The next morning, Friday, the whole town seemed to know. That was the thing about small towns. Information moved through them like weather, fast and indifferent to privacy. By the time Eliza and her mother drove into Caldwell Creek in their battered wagon, people were already gathering. Not in any organized way, not in a crowd exactly, just collecting on the edges of things, standing in doorways, drifting toward the center of town with that particular frontier restlessness that gathered wherever something difficult was about to happen. Croft had made it formal. He'd had his man post a notice outside the land office the evening before. The Hartwell property. Lien foreclosure. It named the debt, named the debtor, named the creditor. It was dry and legal and brutal in the way that official documents are. The way they can reduce a family's entire existence to 3 paragraphs and a signature. Eliza climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff. She hadn't eaten breakfast. Her mother stayed on the wagon seat, hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. Croft was already there, outside the land office, flanked by 2 of his men, thick-necked hired hands who stood slightly behind him in the way that hired muscle stands when it wants to seem like it's just there by coincidence. He was in his pressed coat, his oiled hair, his smile. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I'm glad you came." "I came to tell you to your face that I won't take your arrangement," Eliza said. Her voice came out louder than she intended. Several people nearby turned. Croft's expression shifted. A slight compression around the eyes, the smile not leaving but becoming something harder underneath. "Then you've come to watch the proceedings." "I came to ask you one more time to give us more time." "I've given you time." "More time. A month. 6 weeks.
I'll find something. Eliza. His voice dropped. He stepped closer. Behind her, she could hear the small sounds of a crowd gathering, boots on dirt, murmured conversation. This is business. I have no animosity toward you. Take the arrangement. It's the sensible choice, and in time you'll understand. She said no. The voice came from behind her. It was deep, not loud exactly, but the kind of voice that had a particular quality to it, the quality of something large that did not need to raise itself to be heard. Unhurried, flat in its syllables, the kind of voice that had spent so many years in empty mountain country that it had forgotten how to perform for an audience. Eliza turned. She would remember later, with uncomfortable clarity, her first impression of Rhett Mercer. He was tall, not just tall, but tall in the way that made you recalibrate the space around him. His shoulders were broad under a coat that had seen hard use, the leather worn pale at the elbows and collar. He had a beard that was neither trimmed nor truly unkempt, just present, the way a man's beard is present when he lives somewhere that a beard is practical rather than decorative. His face was angular, weathered to a dark brown, with lines around the eyes that came from years of squinting at distance. The eyes themselves were gray. He was looking at Croft. He looked at Croft the way a man looks at something that needs to be dealt with, not with anger, which would have given it too much weight, but with a kind of flat assessment, like he was calculating something. The crowd had gone quiet. Croft, to his credit, did not flinch visibly, though something shifted in his posture, barely perceptible, but there. Mercer, he said, this doesn't concern you. Maybe not. Rhett stepped forward. The crowd, without seeming to decide to do it, shifted to give him room. But I'm making it my business. And why would you do that? Rhett looked at Eliza then, just briefly. A quick assessment, the same as the look he'd given Croft, but different in quality. Not calculating, something else. What's the debt? He said. Not to Croft, to Eliza. She blinked. I beg your pardon? The debt. What's owed? She stared at him. Beside her, she could feel Croft's attention sharpening. $460, she said, plus interest. Rhett nodded slowly, like he was working out a problem. He reached inside his coat. What he pulled out was a pouch, heavy. She could hear it from where she stood. He held it out toward Croft. Count it, Rhett said. Croft didn't move for a moment. Then he took the pouch, opened it. His expression, for the first time that Eliza could remember seeing, went genuinely blank with surprise. One of his men tried to look over his shoulder and Croft turned slightly, keeping him from seeing. What is this? Croft said. Payment for the Hartwell debt, in full. Croft stopped, recalibrated. The smile came back, but it was working harder now, less certain of itself. You're paying this woman's debt. I'm paying my wife's debt. The silence that followed was the deepest, most absolute silence Eliza had ever heard in a public place. She said very precisely, You're what? Rhett looked at her. His expression was not apologetic. It was not arrogant either. It was something harder to read, something careful. I'd like to talk to you privately before you say anything else. I think, Eliza said, that you had better explain yourself right now. He studied her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite respect, but something in that neighborhood. All right, he said. Fair enough. They did not go inside. He walked her a few steps away from the crowd, which was considerably less functional as a concept of privacy, given that approximately 40 people were now watching with the concentrated attention of people who had been given an unexpected and dramatic thing to look at on an otherwise dull Friday morning. But Rhett seemed genuinely unbothered by the audience. He spoke in a low voice, which at least meant the nearest dozen people could only catch pieces of it. I know this isn't what you were expecting, he started. That, Eliza said, is an extraordinary understatement. He stopped, waited. She pressed her lips together, breathed. Explain. I came down from the mountain 2 weeks ago to resupply. Heard about your situation from the Abbotts. He paused. I've got a homestead up in the high country, above the tree line, above where most people are willing to go. I've been up there alone for 6 years. Another pause. It's a hard place, hard to maintain alone. You need a housekeeper,
Eliza said flatly. Something moved through his expression that might have been the beginning of something uncomfortable for him. A partner, he said. The mountain kills people who aren't suited for it. I've been watching for someone. You've been watching for someone. Her voice had an edge to it she wasn't trying to control. You've been shopping. No. His voice was patient. I've been waiting. There's a difference. He looked at her steadily. I'm not Croft. I'm not asking for anything you won't agree to, but I need you to understand what the alternative is before you make a decision. The alternative is I find another way. Is there another way? She opened her mouth, closed it. He waited. This is insane, she said, quietly enough that the crowd couldn't hear. Yes, he agreed. You're a stranger. I don't know you. No, and you're asking me to marry you, today. I'm offering to clear your family's debt and give you a place to live that isn't under Silas Croft's thumb. What you do with the rest of it is your decision. He held her gaze. But I'll tell you straight, the mountain is no place for a woman who doesn't want to be there. If you come up that trail hating every minute of it, we'll both be miserable and probably dead before spring. So I'm not asking you to love anything. I'm asking if you're willing to try. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his hands, the size of them, the scarring across the knuckles, the particular roughness that comes from years of outdoor work. She looked at the crowd behind him, at Silas Croft standing among them with his flat smile recalibrating itself. She thought about the widow Hargrove's daughter. She thought about 3 to 4 years. If I say yes, she said, and I go up to this mountain of yours and I decide I want to leave, then you leave, he said. I won't stop you. She didn't know if she believed him. She had no particular reason to. She had no basis for trusting this stranger with the large, scarred hands and the flat gray eyes. She had nothing, which was, when she thought about it clearly, exactly the position she was already in. Swear to me, she said, on whatever you hold sacred. If I want to leave, I can leave. He looked at her for a moment. I swear it. She turned and looked at her mother on the wagon. Margaret Hartwell had been watching. She was watching now, her hands still folded in her lap, her expression careful and neutral in the way of a woman who knew that her opinion was going to be listened to whatever it was, and was trying to make sure whatever she showed didn't tip the decision either way, trying to leave it to her daughter. Eliza walked to the wagon, stood beside it. Mama, she said quietly. I heard enough, her mother said. What do you think? Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at Rhett, who had stayed where he was, not crowding them, not listening. I think Silas Croft would have eaten you alive, she said. I think this man, whatever he is not Silas Croft. She looked at her daughter. Her eyes were dry. She had spent her tears earlier, privately, when she was alone. I think you're braver than you know. Eliza nodded. She walked back to Rhett. All right, she said. The minister, to his credit, did not ask many questions. Reverend Alton Cole had been in Caldwell Creek for 11 years and had learned that the frontier had its own logic, and that imposing the logic of back east propriety on it was an exercise in futility. He had married people in more unusual circumstances than this. He performed the ceremony on the steps of the church, which was the nearest available structure, with the crowd of Caldwell Creek watching from what they apparently judged to be an appropriate distance, which was not very far at all. It was brief. Eliza said the words because the words needed to be said. She did not feel anything in particular while saying them. Not the cold terror she'd expected, not anything romantic or hopeful either. She felt strangely detached, as though she were watching herself from a slight distance, observing a young woman making an enormous, irreversible decision with a kind of hollow pragmatism. Rhett said the words with the same flat steadiness with which he seemed to approach everything. No performance, no sentiment. Just the words. When the Reverend said they were married, Croft's voice came from the crowd. This changes nothing. His voice was controlled, but something sharp was moving underneath it. The original debt is paid, Rhett said. He turned to face Croft. Then he reached into his coat again. This time it was not a pouch. He pulled out a sack, a rough canvas sack, tied at the top. He walked to the church steps and dropped it. The sound it made when it hit the boards was dense, heavy, final. He untied the top and tipped it. Raw gold spilled across the church steps. Chunks of it. Irregular, rough-edged, still bearing traces of the dark rock it had been pulled from, glinting dull and rich in the autumn sunlight. It spread across the boards in a slow, heavy flood, and the sound of it was a series of solid, irrefutable clunks that filled the quiet air. The crowd was absolutely silent. Eliza heard someone, somewhere toward the back, let out a long, slow breath. Croft stood very still. "That's more than 3 times what she owed you," Rhett said. He was looking at Croft with a particular expression. Not triumphant, not angry, just even. Final. "The excess covers any interest, any fees, any interpretation of the note you might be inclined to raise in the future. We're done." Croft's face had done several things in quick succession. The smile was gone. The blankness that had replaced it when he'd first opened the pouch was back, but colder now. He looked at the gold on the steps, then at Rhett, then at Eliza. He said nothing. Rhett looked at Eliza. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the gold on the church steps. She looked at the crowd, the wide-open faces of 40 people who had come to watch a young woman's destruction and were now watching something considerably more complicated. She looked at her mother on the wagon, who had both hands pressed to her mouth, eyes shining. "One moment," Eliza said. She walked to the wagon, climbed up, put her arms around her mother. Her mother's arms came around her tight, so tight it was almost painful, the grip of someone who loves another person more than they can say and is afraid of saying goodbye and knows they have to anyway. "Come visit in the spring," Eliza said into her mother's hair. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she didn't try to stop it. "Wild horses," her mother said. She pulled back, looked at her daughter's face, put one hand against Eliza's cheek. "You are your father's stubborn heart and my better sense. You'll be fine." Eliza climbed down from the wagon. She walked back to where Rhett was waiting. He had a horse, a big animal, dark bay, clearly trail-seasoned, standing with the patience of a creature that was accustomed to waiting while its owner dealt with human complications. Beside it, on a lead rope, was a second horse loaded with supplies. She looked at the loaded horse, looked at Rhett. "You came prepared," she said. "I was fairly confident you'd say yes," he said. Something flickered in her. Not quite anger. Not quite. "Were you?" "No," he said, more quietly. "Actually, I wasn't sure at all." He held out his hand. Not romantically, not gallantly. The way a person holds out a hand to help someone up a steep incline. Practically. She took it. He gave her a boost up onto the bay, which stood absolutely steady. When she was settled in the saddle, she looked back at the town. The crowd was still standing there, 40 people watching her. Silas Croft, very still, not looking at anything in particular. Her mother's wagon, her mother's face, the church steps with gold still scattered across them, glinting in the October light. She had 20 years of memory in that town. She had been born 2 miles from where she was sitting. She had walked those streets in every season, in every mood available to a young woman, through ordinary days and difficult ones. She had buried her father 3 miles south under the elm trees 6 months ago, on a day when the sky was the particular washed-out gray of a spring morning without sun. She looked at it all. Then she turned and followed Rhett Mercer north, up the trail that led into the mountains. They rode in silence for the first hour. It wasn't entirely uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had expected the silence to feel hostile, or at minimum charged with the strangeness of 2 strangers who had just inexplicably married each other riding into wilderness together. Instead, it settled around them like the weather. Just the sound of hooves on the trail, the wind in the aspens, the creek running somewhere to their left, and the mountains growing in front of them with every mile. The trail rose steadily. Caldwell Creek fell away behind them into the valley below, shrinking, its sounds fading until she could no longer hear the occasional clang of the blacksmith shop or the distant bark of dogs. There was just the mountain. She watched Rhett's back ahead of her. The way he sat in the saddle, not performing ease, just genuinely at ease, the horse an extension of something rather than a separate thing he was managing. He watched the trail. He watched the tree line. He watched the sky with a frequency that she gradually recognized as practical. He was reading the weather. After an hour and a half, she said, "How far?" 2 more days' ride, he said. "We'll camp tonight." She looked at the sky. It'll rain tonight. He glanced back at her, a brief look. How do you know? That bank of cloud over the western ridge. My father used to watch the clouds. She paused. He was wrong sometimes, but that particular formation usually means rain by evening. Another brief look, longer this time. Your father farm?
He tried. She was quiet for a moment. He was better with ideas than with practical things. He read a great deal. He had plans. She could say this now without the full weight of grief in it, or almost. He was a good man who was not suited for the particular life he ended up living. Rhett said nothing to that, but she had the sense he was listening. What about you? She said. Where are you from? Kentucky originally. That's a long way from a Colorado mountain. Yes. She waited for more. None came. Your family? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Gone, he said. Long time ago. She did not ask further. The trail steepened. The aspens gave way to pine, the pine to spruce, the air thinning slightly and cooling as they climbed. The light was changing too, the afternoon angle flattening, the shadows of the trees lengthening across the trail. She was cold before she admitted it to herself. She had brought a coat. She'd grabbed it that morning, some forward-looking instinct having made the decision for her, and she pulled it tighter. At some point, without discussion, Rhett veered off the main trail onto a narrower track she wouldn't have noticed on her own. They followed it for 20 minutes into a hollow sheltered by a rock outcrop, where a small clearing beside a stream offered flat ground and natural protection on two sides. He dismounted. She watched him work, quick and efficient, no wasted motion, the kind of movements that come from doing the same things in the same order for years until they require no conscious thought. He unloaded the pack horse, found a place to hobble both animals on good grass, had a fire started in 15 minutes, and a canvas shelter strung between 2 pine trunks in 20. She watched him do it and was privately honest with herself about the fact that she could not have done any of those things as efficiently. She had been competent at a great many things in Caldwell Creek. This was not Caldwell Creek. He produced food from the pack, hardtack, dried meat, coffee, and assembled a meal that was plain and warm and infinitely better than nothing. They ate. The rain came, as she had predicted, just as the last light left the sky. It pattered on the canvas. The fire hissed slightly under the shelter's protection. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was not the misery she had been bracing herself for. After a while, she said, "You owe me a conversation." He looked at her across the fire. "I've just married a complete stranger and ridden into the wilderness," she said. "I think I'm owed some information." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his cup. "What do you want to know?" "Why me specifically, out of everyone in that valley?" He looked at the fire. His face in the firelight was different than it was in full daylight. Softer in the angles, harder to read. "The abbot spoke well of you, said you'd tried to find other options before coming to them. Said you gave back the money Tom offered you. That was because he couldn't afford it." "Yes." He looked at her. "That's why." She sat with that a moment. "What is this homestead?" she said. "What does life look like up there?" He was quiet for a while. Not evasively, she thought, but the way a person is quiet when they're trying to describe something that doesn't translate easily into words. "It's a cabin," he said finally. "Solid. Took me 2 years to build it right. There's a lake, a real one, mountain-fed. Good fishing. The land around it is hard but workable. I've got a root cellar, a smokehouse, a small barn. And you've been there alone." 6 years. She looked at him. "Why?" He looked back at her. His expression did something complicated. A slight tightening, something moving behind it that he chose not to bring to the surface. "That's a longer conversation," he said. "All right," she said. "We appear to have time." Something shifted in his face. It might have been amusement. It was too brief and too uncertain to be sure. "Maybe tomorrow," he said. The rain was steady now on the canvas. The fire was smaller. She was warm enough, barely. She had a bedroll. He had provided one without comment, without anything that might have been an expectation attached to it, which she noted and filed away. She lay down. She looked up at the canvas above her. She thought about the gold spilling across the church steps. She thought about the look on Silas Croft's face. She thought about her mother's arms around her, the grip of someone saying goodbye while trying not to say goodbye.
She thought about the gray-eyed stranger on the other side of the fire, who had ridden down from a mountain with a sack of gold and a second horse, and a proposal that was either the most sensible insane thing she'd ever heard or the most insane sensible thing. She didn't sleep for a long time, but she didn't feel afraid. That was the thing she would think about later, in the months to come, when she tried to find the beginning of it, the specific, identifiable moment when fear stopped being the dominant thing. She hadn't felt afraid. She had felt cold and uncertain and completely untethered from everything she had known, but not afraid. The rain fell. The fire breathed. Somewhere in the dark, the horses moved against their hobbles. Eliza Hartwell, Eliza Mercer. Now, in the eyes of whatever law applied to a 2-minute frontier ceremony, closed her eyes. The mountain waited above them, patient as the old things always are, for them to climb toward it in the morning. The second day of riding nearly broke her, and she refused to let him see it. The trail on the first morning had been demanding. The trail on the second morning was something else entirely. A switchback climb through terrain that seemed designed to punish the unprepared, narrow ledges where the drop to the left made her stomach clench if she looked at it directly. Loose shale that the horses navigated with an expertise she found herself grateful for and slightly terrified by. The air was thinner up here. She noticed it in her lungs first, then in her head. A faint, persistent pressure behind her eyes, a shortness of breath on the steeper sections that she refused to mention. Rhett rode ahead without comment. He had checked on her twice. Glancing back at intervals she gradually recognized as deliberate, not casual, and both times she had met his eyes with an expression she hoped communicated competence rather than the low-grade panic she was actually managing. He hadn't pushed the pace. She wasn't sure if that was consideration or simply his normal speed in this terrain. She couldn't tell yet how to read him, which was its own kind of exhausting on top of everything else. They had broken camp that morning with minimal conversation. He had the fire going before she was fully awake. She'd heard the sound of it and opened her eyes to find the canvas gray with early light and a cup of coffee sitting near her bedroll, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who had decided that getting another person caffeinated was logistically useful. She had sat up, wrapped in the blanket, and drunk it without a word. He had eaten standing, watching the weather on the ridge above. "Clear," he'd said when he caught her looking. "Good," she'd said. That had been the entirety of their morning conversation. Now, hours into the climb, the tree line fell away behind and below them, and Eliza got her first proper look at the high country. It stopped her breath in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. The world up here was vast in a way that was almost violent, a scale that the human eye was not entirely equipped to process. Ridge after ridge, the dark green of spruce giving way to gray rock, and then, on the highest peaks, to white. The sky was the deep particular blue that only exists above 10,000 feet, a blue with actual depth to it, like looking into water. Clouds moved across it with unhurried authority. She had lived her entire life in a valley. She had known, in an abstract sense, that mountains were large. She had not understood what large meant until this moment. "First time above the tree line?" Rhett said. She realized she had stopped her horse. "Yes." He had stopped too, a few yards ahead, and turned to look at her looking at it. "It does that to people," he said. "First time." "Does it stop doing that?" He considered the question with the seriousness of someone who didn't answer things carelessly. "No," he said. "You just stop being surprised by it." She looked at it a while longer. Then she nudged the horse forward. They rode another hour before she heard the water. It came before she could see its source. A sound distinct from the small trickle sounds of mountain runoff. Something fuller, more sustained. Then the trail bent around a granite outcrop, and the lake was simply there, stretched out in the hollow of the mountain like something the landscape had cupped in its hands, its surface deep green in the shadow of the ridge and pale silver where the afternoon light struck it directly. It was perhaps a quarter-mile across. The peaks around it were reflected in it with startling clarity. At the far edge, a waterfall came down a rock face and hit the water in a white plume that sent ripples out in slow, concentric circles. On the near shore, built against a rise of rock that sheltered it on the north and west, was the cabin. It was not what she'd expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. It was large for a one-man build. She could see immediately that it had not been thrown together but constructed with the kind of deliberate attention that comes from knowing the structure has to survive whatever the mountain puts against it. The logs were squared and fitted tight, the gaps chinked carefully with what looked like a clay and moss mixture. A covered porch ran along the front. The roof had a steep pitch, she would understand why after the first serious snowfall, and extended over the porch overhang. A stone chimney rose from the near end. A woodpile to the right of the cabin was stacked 8 feet high and 10 feet across, covered with a lean-to roof.
"You built this yourself," she said. "Took 2 years," he said. "Made some mistakes in the first one." "What was the mistake?" "The first door faced west. Wind off the ridge in winter came straight into the cabin every time you opened it." He looked at the structure with an expression that was difficult to characterize. Not pride exactly, but something like the satisfaction of having learned something expensive and then applied it correctly. "The second cabin faces southeast."
There was a first cabin? The wind tore most of it apart in the second winter. He said it without apparent bitterness, which she found oddly impressive. "Built this one with that in mind." He led her around to a small barn, not much more than a large shed with proper walls and roof, where the horses were settled with water and hay. She watched him do it. He worked with the horses the way he worked with everything. No wasted motion, no performance, just the task and the completion of it. The cabin door had a bar lock, a heavy pine timber that dropped into iron brackets, the kind of lock that had nothing to do with social convention and everything to do with what might try to get through a door on a mountain in the middle of winter. Inside, she stopped and looked. It was a single main room, large, with a second smaller room partitioned off toward the back by a wall of rough-cut boards. The main room held a stone fireplace at the far end, a heavy table with 2 chairs, shelving along one wall stacked with supplies, preserved food, tools, equipment, in an order that was clearly systematic rather than random. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Pelts, beaver, fox, one that she thought might be bear, were stacked on a rack near the door. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and something else she couldn't quite identify, some underlying scent that was simply the smell of a place that has been inhabited and cared for. It was rough. It was plain. It was more solid than anything she had expected. "The back room," Rhett said. He said it with a slight awkwardness that was the first time she'd seen anything approaching awkwardness in him. I put a second sleeping area back there. For you. I'll take the main room." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "I told you I wasn't asking for anything you didn't agree to." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. The back room was small, barely large enough for the rope-frame bed and the trunk that sat at its foot, but it had a tiny window that looked out on the lake, and the window was real glass, which struck her as remarkable, given where they were. She stood at it and looked out at the water for a moment. Behind her, Rhett said, "The glass was the hardest thing to get up here. Took 3 trips." A pause. Figured whoever was in that room would want to see outside. She turned to look at him in the doorway. He had misjudged the height of the door frame and had to drop his head slightly to stand in it, which for some reason made him seem, in that moment, very human. "You planned this room for someone," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "I planned for the possibility," he said. She looked at the window again. The lake was turning gold in the late afternoon light. "Thank you," she said. "For the glass?" He nodded once, turned and went back to the main room. She sat on the edge of the bed. The rope frame creaked under her weight. She pressed her palms flat on the rough wool blanket covering it and looked at the window, at the golden lake beyond it. She had made an enormous, irreversible decision. She was 8,000 feet above the life she had known, in a cabin built by a stranger who was now technically her husband, in a place she'd never seen before 2 days ago. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up, rolled her sleeves, and went to see what needed doing before dark. The first week was an education in her own ignorance. She had thought of herself as capable. She had run a household, cooked, preserved food, maintained a garden, tended livestock. She had understood herself to be a practical person with practical skills. The mountain took each of those skills and demonstrated, with patient and impersonal thoroughness, that they applied here only partially, incompletely, or not at all. The wood situation alone was humbling. In Caldwell Creek she had split firewood. Her father had never been strong, and the task had fallen to her. She knew how to swing an axe. What she did not know was the scale of the operation at this altitude, where a single winter could require more wood than she'd split in her entire life, where the difference between enough wood and not enough could be the difference between surviving and not, where the wood had to be split and stacked and covered in specific ways to season properly and burn efficiently. Rhett showed her without comment. He demonstrated the technique for the grain of mountain spruce, which was different from the oak she'd worked with before. He showed her how to identify the wood that would burn well versus the wood that would burn wet and smoke up the cabin. He did not condescend. He did not tell her she was doing it wrong. He simply showed her once and then let her work. And when she made the mistake of going against the grain on a particularly knotty piece and the axe skidded dangerously, he said, from where he was stacking wood 15 feet away without looking up, "Go with the knot, not against it. Find the line in it." She found the line. The piece split cleanly. He didn't say anything else. She chose to take this as a form of encouragement. The water was another thing. There was no well. The lake was the water source. And in the warmer months, it meant daily trips with buckets down a trail that was shorter than it looked and steeper than it was comfortable to navigate with full pails. She developed blisters on her hands the second day and did not mention them because mentioning them would not make them stop. By the end of the first week, they had become calluses. Her back ached in a way she had not experienced before, a deep, muscular ache that told her she was using muscles she hadn't known existed. She was cold most of the time, not miserable. The cabin was warmer than she'd feared, and Rhett kept the fire going with the attention of someone who understood fire as a survival matter rather than a comfort matter, but cold in the persistent low-grade way of someone whose body had not yet adjusted to what 8,000 feet in October meant. She slept more deeply than she had ever slept in her life. There was that. Rhett was difficult to read. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He occupied the main room of the cabin with a thoroughgoing competence that she both respected and found slightly intimidating. He was always doing something useful, never idle, moving through his days with the steady economy of a man for whom wasted time was a practical problem. He cooked adequately. He cleaned without being asked. He brought her coffee in the morning with the same matter-of-fact gestures on the trail, and she understood this was not sentiment but function. A warm person was a more useful person. He spoke when he had something to say. He did not fill silence. She had grown up in a household where her father talked constantly, ideas, stories, observations, theories about the nature of things. She had not known until now that silence could be a form of communication, or that it could be comfortable. On the fourth evening, she came back from the lake with the water buckets and found him at the table skinning a rabbit with the particular focused attention he gave to most physical tasks. He had 2 of them. "Trapline was good," he said, without looking up. "I saw your traps on the East Trail," she said. She set the buckets down. "Can I learn it?" He looked up then. "The trapping? If I'm going to be useful here, I need to know how things work." She met his eyes. "I don't want to be dependent on your knowledge. What if something happened to you?" He regarded her for a moment. His expression did that difficult-to-read thing again, something moving through it that didn't quite make it to the surface. "All right," he said. "I'll show you the line tomorrow." "Thank you." He looked back at the rabbit. "You're not what I expected," he said. She sat down across the table. "What did you expect?" "Someone more frightened," he said. "Or more angry." "I was frightened," she said. "I'm still frightened some of the time." "Of me?" She thought about it honestly. "Of failing," she said. "Of not being able to do this." He was quiet for a moment. "You're doing it," he said. She wasn't sure if that was meant as reassurance or as simple fact. With Rhett, the two weren't always distinguishable. The days developed a rhythm, which she had not anticipated, and which turned out to be one of the things that made survival possible. Not the comfort of routine exactly, nothing on the mountain was truly comfortable, but the predictability of it, the sense that each day had a structure that could be relied upon even when the contents of the day were difficult. Morning. Water, fire, food. Then the outdoor work, wood, traps, whatever the season demanded. Then the indoor work, preserving, repairing, preparing. Then the long evenings where the fire burned and the mountain went dark outside, and the 2 of them occupied the same room with a peculiar companionship that she couldn't entirely name. She began to read his silences the way she might have read a face. There was the silence that meant he was working through a problem. There was the silence that meant he was listening to something outside that she wasn't yet trained to hear. There was the silence that fell after she said something that he was turning over in his mind, and which sometimes produced a response 10 minutes later, as though he needed to think through the structural integrity of his answer before offering it. She started to talk more, not to fill silence. She had accepted that silence was not something to be filled here, but because the evenings were long, and the evenings were when she thought most clearly, and she had always thought better by speaking. She talked about her father, about the books he'd loved, the particular volumes he'd read to her as a child. She could still recite long passages of certain things, which surprised Rhett visibly the first time she quoted a stanza from memory. She talked about what it had been like to watch him decline, the slowness of it, the way the man she'd known had retreated incrementally behind a face that stopped working properly, and how the grief of that was both better and worse than the shock of sudden loss. He listened. He did not offer comfort. She found unexpectedly that she didn't want it. What she wanted was exactly what he offered, the particular quality of attention of someone who is genuinely listening rather than waiting to respond. One evening, about 2 weeks in, she asked him again about Kentucky. "You said your family was gone," she said. "What happened?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. She had learned to wait. "Fever," he said, "when I was 22. My mother, my 2 sisters. Within the same month." He looked at the fire. "My father had died the year before, a different thing, so it was just me after." "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded slightly, acknowledging it without dwelling. "And you came west," she said. "Not right away. I tried to. There were people who expected me to stay, take on the family farm, settle down." He was quiet again. "I tried for a year. It wasn't." He stopped. "The farm and I didn't agree with each other. And the mountains did." He looked at her then, across the fire. Something in his expression that she was beginning to recognize. Not quite opening up, but the thing just before it. "The mountains are honest," he said. "They don't ask you to pretend. You're cold or you're warm, fed or hungry, safe or not. There's no performance." He paused. "I got tired of performing." She understood that in a way she hadn't expected to. "What were you performing?" "Someone who was fine," he said, flatly, factually, the way he said most things. She looked at the fire for a while. "I know about that," she said. He didn't say anything to that, but she felt the quality of the silence between them shift almost imperceptibly, like the light changing by a degree too small to name. October moved toward November. The mountain began its preparations. Eliza recognized winter preparing because she could see it in everything. The way the spruce trees seemed to deepen into themselves, the way the lake surface turned from silver to a flat, dark gray in the afternoons, the way the frost stayed on the ground longer each morning and the window glass required scraping before she could see out of it. The high peaks had been white for weeks. Now the white was descending. The work accelerated. Rhett set a pace in these weeks before the snow hit that she had to consciously keep up with, not because he pushed her, but because the mountain's logic was clear. What wasn't done before the snow would not be done until spring. They put up more wood. He taught her to smoke meat, strips of elk he'd taken 2 weeks back, over the smoker behind the barn, and the process was 2 days of careful tending that produced enough preserved meat to make a significant difference in the winter's food supply. He taught her to check the cabin's chinking and reseal the places where the clay had cracked and dried over the summer. He also, without announcing it, began teaching her to shoot. The rifle he gave her was a Winchester repeater, shorter than the one he carried, with a stock that had been modified in some way she didn't understand that made it fit her frame better than a standard issue would have. He had this rifle. He had presumably anticipated the need. She did not ask about this. She simply learned. She was not a natural shot. Her first 24 attempts were educational, primarily in the way that failure is educational. Rhett watched, offered adjustments in the same quiet, practical way he offered everything, and did not react to her misses with anything other than the next piece of instruction. By the end of the second week with the rifle, she was hitting her targets with enough reliability that he stopped correcting her stance and started correcting her point of aim instead, which she understood was an upgrade.
"Why do I need to know this?" she asked him one evening. She hadn't meant it as a challenge. She was curious. He looked up from the harness he was mending. "Mountain lion," he said. "Bear, occasionally. Someone comes up the trail with intentions that aren't friendly." He returned to the harness. "I'm not always here."
"Where do you go?" "Trapline takes 2 days sometimes. If I'm tracking something longer." He glanced up. "I'm not going to leave you somewhere you can't defend yourself." She thought about that for a while. She thought about the word defend and about the fact that he had said it to her straight and direct, without the uncomfortable dance that men in Caldwell Creek performed around the idea that a woman might need to be capable rather than simply protected. "All right," she said. "You're getting better," he said. "Not as encouragement, as fact." "I know," she said. Something happened in his expression, the ghost of a thing, brief and involuntary, that she thought might have been the beginning of a smile. It was the last relatively warm evening before the first real snow. She didn't know that at the time. She knew it looking back. They were on the porch. He was doing something with a length of rope, some kind of maintenance task she'd lost track of. And she had a bowl of dried beans she was sorting through, picking out the damaged ones. The sky above the lake had gone the deep orange and purple of a mountain sunset, the peaks catching the last light in a way that was almost indecent in its beauty. The water was perfectly still. A loon called from somewhere on the far shore. Once, then twice. "I didn't hate it," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. He looked at her. "Coming up here," she said. "I thought I would. I thought I'd resent every minute of it." She looked at the lake. "I don't." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you feel instead?" She thought about it. "Afraid sometimes. Tired most of the time." She paused. "Awake," she said. "More awake than I've been in a long time." He was looking at the lake too. "The mountain does that," he said. "Is that why you stayed?" He thought about it in the way he thought about things he wanted to answer honestly. "Partly," he said, "and partly, down there, in the towns." He stopped, started again. "Down there, I never felt like I was quite the right size for the space I was in. Too big, too quiet, too—" He shook his head slightly. "Up here, the scale is different. Everything's large. I fit." She looked at him in the fading light. This man who had ridden into a town he clearly found uncomfortable, in front of a crowd he clearly did not enjoy, to make a transaction he clearly had thought about for long enough to bring a second horse. "You fit," she repeated. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said. "Actually, it does." The loon called again. The last light left the peaks. The cold came down fast, the way it does in the mountains, immediate and total. He stood, picked up the rope. "Early start tomorrow," he said. "Weather's going to change." She stood too, picking up the bowl. At the door she stopped. "Rhett." He turned. "I'm glad I said yes," she said, "for whatever that's worth." He looked at her for a moment. His face did its complicated, difficult-to-read thing. Then he nodded. Once, the same nod he gave when acknowledging things he didn't have words for, or had words for but chose not to use. She went inside. He stood on the porch a moment longer in the cold and the dark, looking at the still water of the lake, before he followed. The next morning, she woke to white. Snow had come in the night, not gently, not as a suggestion, but in the decisive way of the high country, covering everything without apology. The window above her bed showed a world transformed, the dock below the cabin, the rock outcroppings, the spruce trees bent slightly under their new weight, all of it muffled and changed and perfectly, silently white. She heard Rhett moving in the main room, the fire already going, the smell of coffee. She lay there for a moment longer, looking at the white world outside her small window. She was 8,000 feet up a mountain. It was November. It was going to get considerably worse before it got better. She understood that, with a clarity that had nothing of romance in it. The cold was real. The isolation was real. The months ahead were going to demand things from her that she couldn't entirely predict yet. She got up anyway, pulled on her boots, wrapped herself in the wool coat that was already becoming the garment she wore more than any other, opened the door to the main room. Rhett was at the fire, adding a log. He looked up. "Snow," she said. "First real one," he said. More tonight. She went to the window and looked out at the lake. The surface was beginning to form a thin skin of ice at the shallows near the dock. The peaks were buried in cloud. Right, she said, and turned to pick up the water buckets. He watched her do it without comment. She was learning, and she knew it, and the learning was not comfortable or seamless or anything close to what people meant when they described growth as a beautiful thing. It was cold, and it was heavy, and it was one aching muscle after another. But she picked up the buckets, and she went to get the water. The second snowfall came 3 days after the first, and did not stop for 11 days. Eliza knew it was serious when Rhett stopped going outside except when absolutely necessary. He was not a man who stayed indoors by preference. She had learned that about him clearly enough in the weeks before the snow. He moved through the cabin in those early blizzard days with the contained energy of something that understood stillness as a temporary condition rather than a natural state, checking the barn twice daily through the covered walkway he'd built between the two structures, splitting wood under the porch overhang, monitoring the snow accumulation on the roof with the focused attention of someone calculating a weight problem. "How bad does it get?" she asked on the fourth day, when the wind had been loud enough to make conversation difficult for the previous 12 hours. He looked up from the map he was studying, hand-drawn, covered in notation she couldn't yet fully interpret. "Bad," he said. "That's not an answer. Last bad winter, I had drifts up to the porch eaves." He set the map down. "Couldn't open the front door for 6 days, used the barn walkway." He looked at her with his characteristic directness. "This one has that feeling." She absorbed this. "What do we do?" "What we've been doing," he said. "We maintain the fire, we manage the food supply. We keep the barn animals alive, and we wait." He paused. "And we don't do anything stupid." Define stupid. Going out in a whiteout. Overworking in the cold and sweating through your clothes. Eating more than the rationing allows because the first week feels manageable. He ticked these off not as lectures, but as the specific identified mistakes he had evidently made or watched others make. The mountain kills people who get impatient with it. She thought about that for a while. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls with the kind of persistence that had intention in it. She could feel the cold radiating through the logs, even with the fire running hard. "Have you been in danger up here?" she asked. "Really in danger." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "When?" He stood and went to add wood to the fire. His back was to her when he spoke. "The 3rd year I was here. I got careless in January, went out on the trap line during what I thought was a break in the weather. Storm came back in faster than I expected." He set the log carefully, adjusted it. "Made it back, barely." "How barely?" He turned. His expression was level, but there was something behind it. The particular look of a person who has been genuinely frightened by something and has since organized that fear into something more useful. "My hands were frostbitten, lost the feeling in 2 fingers for the better part of a month. Thought for a while I might lose one of them." He held up his left hand. In the firelight she could see it, the slight irregularity in the index finger, the way it didn't quite bend the same as the others. It came back, but it was a near thing. She looked at the finger. She had noticed the irregularity before and not asked. Now she understood it. "And you stayed," she said. "I stayed." He sat back down, because the mistake was mine, not the mountain's. The mountain did what it always does. I was the one who got it wrong. He looked at her steadily. "That's the thing about up here. It's never personal. It's never cruel. It just is. You work within it or you don't." She sat with that for a while. Outside, a gust hit the cabin hard enough that the fire flickered from the pressure change in the chimney. "Tell me more," she said. He looked at her. "About the years up here," she said. "All of it. I need something to do with my mind, and we're apparently going to be here a while." Something crossed his face. Not reluctance exactly, but the look of a man who had spent 6 years with his own company and was recalibrating what it meant to have an audience. He looked at the fire for a moment, then he started to talk. The story came out in pieces over several days, the way things come out when someone has never told them before and isn't sure of the shape of them yet. She learned that he had come west originally following the rumors of gold, not from greed exactly, but from the specific desperation of a 22-year-old who had buried his whole family inside 12 months and needed somewhere to put his energy that was large enough to absorb it. He had worked in a mining camp near Silverton for 2 seasons, learned the mountains, learned the work, learned enough about reading rock and terrain to understand when he was looking at something significant. In his second year, following a watercourse up into territory that most men had judged too high and too remote to bother with, he had found the vein. "How large?" she asked. They were at the table, a candle between them, the storm pressing at the walls. "Large enough that I understood immediately why men kill each other over gold," he said. "I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought I was misreading the signs." "But you weren't." "I wasn't." He turned his cup in his hands. "I didn't tell anyone. I went back to the camp, finished out the season, acted like nothing had happened. Then I left and didn't come back to the camp." "Why didn't you just take what you found and leave? Go somewhere easier?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'd already started to understand that easier wasn't— I didn't want easier," he said. "I wanted the mountain. I wanted what living up here actually was. The gold was a means, not the end." She looked at him. "You used it to build the cabin." "Over time, taking small amounts, making trips down to the valley, bringing back what I needed." He paused. Carefully, quietly. "And someone found out," she said. She had been anticipating this part. His jaw tightened slightly. "Two men from the old camp, Dalton and a man called Fierce. That was his actual name, or what he went by. They'd apparently kept watch on me when I left Silverton. Followed me eventually at some distance. Put pieces together." He stopped. "They came up to the homestead in my 4th year. Not my first winter, not my second. They waited until they were certain." "What did they do?" "They came at night." His voice had gone flat in a way she was beginning to recognize as the register he used for things he'd processed into fact, stripped of the emotional content because the emotional content had been worked through already, and what remained was just the structure of what happened. "I heard them on the porch, and I wasn't fast enough. One of them hit me across the back of the head before I got the door open." A pause. "When I woke up, the cabin was ransacked. They'd found some of the stored gold. Not all of it, not the vein's location, but enough to hurt, and they left you." "They left me alive because they thought I'd die anyway," he said. "It was February. I had a head wound, a fire that had gone cold, and no way to get to the barn in the state I was in." He said this with a kind of grim, factual precision. "I was unconscious for parts of 2 days. When I came back around, I had to—" He stopped, chose the next words carefully. "I had to decide to survive. Not just let the body do it. Actually decide." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind had dropped slightly. Not stopped, but resting, gathering itself. "How?" she said quietly. "You make a list," he said. "In your head. Fire first, then water, then food, then see what's broken, and whether it can be fixed." He looked at her. "You don't think about the whole of it. You think about the next thing. Only the next thing." She thought about Friday morning in Caldwell Creek, about standing in front of Silas Croft with no good options and a mother sitting in a wagon behind her. She thought about how her mind had gone, in that moment, very small and very specific. Not the whole of it, just the next thing. "I know about that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you do." She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked at the candle. "The men, Dalton and Fierce. What happened to them?" Something moved through his expression. "Dalton is in a prison in Denver. The law caught him on something unrelated the following summer." He was quiet for a beat. "Fierce is not anywhere anymore." She didn't ask for elaboration. The way he said it was sufficient. Over the following days, as the storm locked them in with an intensity that made the first week feel like a warm-up, the conversation did not stop. It changed shape, moved from the large revelatory territory of his history to the smaller, more daily territory of two people learning how to occupy a shared space during weeks of enforced proximity. She learned that he was a poor sleeper. She heard him in the main room sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, the quiet sounds of a man awake when he didn't want to be. She learned that he had an unexpected memory for things he'd read. He had a small collection of books on a shelf she'd noticed early on, but not yet fully examined, and she discovered that he had apparently read each of them multiple times with the thoroughness that comes from having long winters and a single shelf. He could quote things without flagging them as quotes, as if the words had simply become part of how he thought. She learned that he did not like to fail at physical tasks and had limited patience with his own mistakes in a way that he did not apply to anyone else. She watched him work through a problem with a broken trap mechanism one afternoon, his frustration visible in the set of his jaw, his voice when he finally spoke more clipped than usual. "Leave it," she said. He gave her a look. "You're going to force it and break something worse," she said. "Leave it for an hour." He left it for 40 minutes, came back and fixed it in 5. He didn't comment on this, but she caught the slight compression at the corner of his mouth that she had begun to identify as his version of acknowledging a point. She also discovered, with the timing she could have done without, that she was a more emotional person than she had believed herself to be. It happened on a night in late December, when the cold had reached a depth that made the air inside the cabin feel thin even with the fire burning well. She had been sorting through the food stores, taking inventory, checking what was holding and what was turning, and she found, tucked behind a tin of dried beans, a small bundle of letters tied with a piece of cord, her father's handwriting. She didn't even know she'd packed them. Some automatic, grief-driven part of her must have done it without her awareness. She sat on the floor of the storage alcove holding them, not opening them, and something happened in her chest that she had been successfully containing for 2 months. She was crying before she knew she was going to be. Not delicately, not the restrained, dignified grief she'd managed at the funeral and in the days immediately after. This was the other kind, the kind that had been waiting behind everything else, held back by the sustained emergency of the last 2 months. Rhett found her 20 minutes later when she didn't come back to the main room. He stood in the doorway of the alcove for a moment, taking in what he was seeing. She looked up at him. Her face was a complete disaster, and she was aware of this and past caring about it. "Letters," she managed. "My father's." He sat down on the floor across from her. Not beside her. Across, where she could see him if she wanted to or ignore him if she wanted to. He didn't say anything. He didn't reach for her. He just sat there, solidly present, letting her be in whatever state she was in without making it about his reaction to it. She cried for a while longer. He stayed. When it stopped, gradually, inexorably, the way it always stops eventually, she wiped her face on her sleeve and looked at the letters in her hands. "He would have found this ridiculous," she said. Her voice was rough. "The whole situation. He would have had 100 questions about the geological formation of the gold vein and very little useful to say about the practical matters." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "Sounds like someone worth missing," he said. She laughed. It came out a little broken, but it was a laugh. "He was," she said. "He was absolutely worth missing." He stood, eventually, and held out a hand to pull her up. She took it. His grip was careful, not gentle in a performance of gentleness, but careful in the way he was careful with things that required care. He let go immediately, when she was on her feet. "Food's getting cold," he said. "Right," she said. They went back to the main room. He did not refer to it again, and she did not refer to it again, and somehow this was the exactly correct thing. January arrived, and the winter deepened. There was a week in early January when the temperature dropped low enough that the inside of the cabin window developed a sheet of ice on the glass itself, not just the exterior. The kind of cold that made going to the barn a genuine calculation of risk and necessity, because the 20 feet of covered walkway was not properly insulated, and the cold came through it like water through a sieve. The animals needed feeding and watering regardless, which meant the barn trips happened, but Rhett moved them to the shortest possible intervals and the minimum necessary exposure. She learned to read the weather in the way he read it, not just the obvious signs of cloud and wind, but the subtler indicators. The sound the snow made underfoot when the temperature was dropping versus when it was relatively stable. The quality of the light through the window glass at different times of day, and what it meant about what was coming. The behavior of the horses, which were considerably more reliable meteorologists than she had expected horses to be. She also, during those long, cold evenings, began to understand the shape of the thing between them more clearly. It was not romantic. She would have resisted that word, and not out of dishonesty. It simply wasn't the right container for what it was. It was something more structural than that, more load-bearing. They had been thrown into conditions that stripped away everything performative, everything social, everything that people use to present themselves to each other in ordinary life. And what was left when all of that was gone was whatever was actually there, What was there she was finding was more than she had expected. He trusted her with things, not explicitly, not in stated declarations, but in the small, practical ways that trust actually operates. He told her where the secondary food cache was, in the root cellar under a false floor she hadn't known about, not because he expected disaster, but because someone else knowing made disaster less catastrophic. He showed her the map of the gold vein's location, tracing it for her with his finger, explaining the markers. He did not present this as a gift. He presented it as information she should have. She understood what it meant. He had spent 4 years protecting this information with his life. He was showing her because she needed to know it. The reasoning was practical, and the practice of it was trust. "You're showing me where the gold is," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "You live here. You should know. And you're not worried about—" She stopped. "About what?" She met his eyes. "About whether I'm trustworthy." He held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he said. "I'm not worried about that." She looked back at the map. "Why not?" "Because of how you gave back Tom Abbott's $10, he said simply. She stared at him. "You decided to trust me with the location of a gold vein because of a $10 bill. Because of what it meant about who you are," he corrected. "There's a difference." She thought about that for a while. She thought about Silas Croft and about the specific quality of being seen as something to be managed rather than someone to be known. She thought about the difference between those two things and how rarely the second one happened. "Thank you," she said. He folded the map. "Don't lose it," he said. She took it from him, turned it in her hands. "Rhett?" He looked up. "Why did you really come down from the mountain?" she said. "To Caldwell Creek." Truthfully, he was quiet for long enough that she thought she had pushed past whatever invisible boundary she had been carefully not pushing past. Then he said, "I had everything I needed up here, materially. I knew how to survive. I knew how to work the land, manage the supplies, get through winter." He looked at his hands. "But there's a kind of— after 6 years alone, there's a kind of silence that stops being peaceful and starts being something else." "What kind of something else?" "The kind that starts asking you questions you don't want to answer," he said. He looked at the fire. "About what it's all for, about whether surviving alone is the same as living." He was quiet. "I didn't go to Caldwell Creek looking for anyone specific. I went because I needed to be somewhere with people long enough to remember what that felt like." His jaw moved slightly. "Then I heard about you." She waited. "The way the Abbotts told it, you gave back the money, and you were scared and you didn't show it, and you hadn't given up yet, even though you were out of options." He looked at her. "That sounded like someone who could survive up here, someone who deserved better than what they were about to get." She held his gaze. The fire moved between them. Outside, the mountain was silent for once. The wind had dropped in the night and not come back, and the silence it left was vast and clean and complete. "And now," she said, "after 2 months of actually knowing me, am I what you thought?" He considered it. Seriously, the way he considered things worth considering. "No," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You're more stubborn," he said, "and considerably harder to stay ahead of." Something in his expression shifted. "And yes, you're exactly what I thought." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had grown up too large for the spaces that were offered to him and had built his own instead, who communicated primarily in action and silence and occasional pieces of honesty that arrived like gifts because they were not dispensed freely, whose face, in the firelight, after 2 months, had stopped being the face of a frightening stranger and become something she could read. Not without effort, but she could read it. "I lied earlier," she said. He looked at her sharply. "When I said I don't feel afraid," she said, "I am afraid. Right now, specifically." She held his gaze. "Because I'm starting to care about how this goes. And that's a different kind of afraid than the kind I had at the beginning." He was very still. "What kind do you have now?" "The kind where there's something worth being afraid of losing," she said. The silence that followed was the longest kind. Not empty, but full of things that neither of them had yet found the words for, and both of them knew it, and somehow the knowing itself was its own form of language. He looked at the fire, looked back at her. "Go to sleep, Eliza," he said. But his voice had changed. Barely, but she caught it. The slight roughness. The way her name sounded in his mouth when he wasn't keeping careful control of the distance between them. She stood. At the door to her room, she stopped. She did not say anything, neither did he, but she looked at him for a moment, at this man who had waited alone on a mountain for 6 years until he found someone who might be able to stand beside him in it, and something settled in her chest. Not resolution, not certainty, something quieter and more durable than either. She went to her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the mountain, the absolute enormous silence of snow and altitude in winter, broken only by the sound of the fire in the next room and the occasional settling of the logs in it, and underneath all of it, the slow, steady sounds of another person breathing on the other side of a thin wall. She had been alone in her grief for 8 months before she came up here. She had been alone in her fear for longer than that. She was not alone now. The understanding of that arrived without ceremony, without the weight she might have expected it to carry. It was simply there, like the fire, like the snow, like the mountain itself. She closed her eyes. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks, and the stars above the lake were extraordinary. The kind of stars that only exist at altitude and distance from human light, thick and white and staggering in number, burning above the frozen world with an indifference that was somehow not cold at all. She didn't see them. She was already asleep. Spring did not arrive on the mountain the way it arrived in the valley. Down in Caldwell Creek, spring was a gradual thing. Mud season first, then green coming back into the fields. Then the particular sweetness in the air that meant the worst was over. Up here, spring was a negotiation. The mountain released winter the way a miser released money, reluctantly, incrementally, taking it back at every opportunity. A week of relative warmth in March would be followed by 2 feet of new snow in April. The lake ice broke up in stages, creaking and groaning through the nights like something alive and unhappy about its situation. The melt came slowly, then all at once, the snowpack releasing itself down the rock faces in thin silver threads that swelled into proper streams as the weeks moved forward. Eliza had been on the mountain for 6 months when she finally understood why Rhett watched the weather with such unrelenting attention. The mountain's moods were not decorative. They were operational. Every shift in the sky meant something, and reading it correctly was the difference between a good day and a bad one, and sometimes between a bad day and a catastrophic one. She had become, over the course of the winter, a different person than the one who had ridden up the trail in October. Not in any way she could have announced or cataloged neatly. The change was in the grain of her, the density of her. Her hands were rougher. Her shoulders had developed a strength she could feel when she worked, a reliable solidity that hadn't been there before. She could read the trap line efficiently, reset a spring mechanism in the cold without cursing at it more than once or twice, identify the weather signs that mattered from the ones that were just weather being weather. She slept deeply and woke quickly, which she had read once was the survival pattern of people who lived in dangerous country and had come to take it seriously. She and Rhett had arrived at something that neither of them named directly, because naming it would have required a conversation that both of them apparently found easier to approach sideways. They moved through the cabin and the homestead with the particular ease of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms, who knew when to speak and when to leave the other alone, who had developed the small practical courtesies of shared space without discussion, who could communicate across the length of a room with a look and a way that would have been impossible 6 months ago. It was not a simple thing. He still had his silences that closed like doors, his mornings when something was working through him that he had no interest in discussing. She still had her temper, which had not improved with altitude. If anything, the mountain had stripped away whatever social patience she'd used to moderate it. And when she was frustrated plainly and without much apology. They had argued twice over the winter about things that were and were not worth arguing about, and both times the argument had ended not in resolution exactly, but in the way arguments end between people who are going to continue living together regardless, a kind of mutual setting down of the issue, a return to the work at hand. But there was the morning in February when she had come back from the barn in a cold so brutal that her fingers had stopped working properly, and he had taken her hands without comment and held them between his, just held them, for the several minutes it took for the warmth to come back, standing in the doorway while the cold came in around them, his hands wrapped around hers with a deliberate, steady care that said more than either of them had yet said directly. She thought about that sometimes. The first sign of real trouble arrived on a Wednesday in late April, which she knew because she had kept a careful tally of the days through the winter. Marks on the inside of the storage alcove door, a habit she'd started in December when the weeks were becoming indistinguishable from each other. Rhett had gone down the mountain. He went periodically, resupply runs mainly, the trips that required navigating the trail to the valley below and back, which took 3 days minimum and sometimes 4 depending on conditions. She had learned to manage the homestead alone during these absences with a competence that was hard-won and that she felt each time as a private point of satisfaction. The first time he'd left for 3 days, she'd spent the first night unable to sleep, the cabin feeling enormous and the sounds of the mountain outside more present than usual. By the third time, she'd used the solitude productively and slept fine. This time he had been gone 2 days when she heard the horses. Not his horses. She knew the particular sound of his animals on the trail, had learned it without intending to. This was different. Multiple animals, moving with the purposeful rhythm of horses that were being pushed rather than horses that were being worked. She was at the woodpile when she heard it, and she stopped, axe in hand, and listened. 4 riders came around the rock outcrop above the cabin. She recognized none of them. They were not the kind of men that people look at and immediately feel comfortable. Not because of any single thing, but because of the sum of things. The way they held themselves in the saddle, the way their eyes moved across the homestead, in the systematic manner of people taking inventory, the particular quality of attention they gave her as they pulled up near the porch. 3 of them were large. The 4th, who rode slightly ahead of the others, was not large but had the bearing of someone who had organized the other 3. He had a thin face, a week's worth of beard, and eyes that were doing careful, constant calculations. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was carefully polite in the way that knives are carefully sheathed. "We're looking for Rhett Mercer's place. Seems we've found it." She did not put down the axe. She kept her hands exactly as they were. "What business do you have with him?" "Business matter," the thin-faced man said. "From down in the valley. We can wait for him if he's not about." She looked at him, looked at the 3 men behind him. One of them was eyeing the barn. Another was looking at the cabin door. "He's not available," she said. "You'll need to come back another time." "That's a fair ride to make twice," the thin-faced man said pleasantly. "We'd rather wait." He moved his horse forward a step. "I said he's not available." Her voice was level. She was proud of that, the levelness of it, the fact that what was happening in her chest was not reaching her voice. "And I'm telling you to leave." The man stopped his horse. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that recalibrated itself. She watched it happen, watched the pleasantness get put aside and something cooler replace it. "You're the wife," he said. "Heard about that?" "Who told you?" "Man down in Caldwell Creek. Said there was a woman up here, and the place was worth visiting." He smiled. It was not a good smile. "Said the man who lives here has something valuable, and that he might be persuaded to share." Silas Croft. She did not say the name aloud. She did not need to. The shape of it was obvious. Croft's hand in this, Croft's information, Croft's refusal to accept the specific humiliation of that October morning as final. She thought very quickly through what she had and didn't have. Rhett had been gone 2 days. He would not be back until tomorrow at the earliest, possibly the day after. She was alone. The rifle was inside the cabin, not on her, not in reach. The axe was in her hands, and the axe was useful for approximately one thing at close range before it became a liability. There were 4 of them and 1 of her. She breathed. Fire first, she thought, then water, then food, then see what's broken and whether it can be fixed. Next thing, she thought, only the next thing. "You need to leave this property," she said. Her voice had not changed, still level, still flat. "I'm telling you once more clearly, so there's no misunderstanding later. Leave." The thin-faced man's smile faded completely. He looked at her the way men look at a problem they've decided to stop negotiating with. He turned slightly in the saddle, a small gesture toward the men behind him. She moved, not toward them. She turned and walked to the cabin door, deliberately, not running, because running changed the dynamic in a way that would have made things worse, pushed through it, and had the Winchester off-the-wall mount in the time it took for the thin-faced man to say something to the riders behind him. She checked the chamber by feel. She'd done it enough times that her hands knew the motion, and walked back out onto the porch. They had spread out slightly. The one who had been eyeing the barn had moved his horse toward it. The other two had come forward. The thin-faced man was still in front, but he had his hand near his hip in a manner that was not at all casual. She raised the rifle, settled it against her shoulder, pointed it at the thin-faced man. "Last time," she said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a situation that has reached the edge of itself and is deciding which way to fall. The thin-faced man looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. He was running the same calculation she understood, assessing whether she would actually fire, weighing the odds, measuring the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. He had 4 men. She had 1 rifle, and whatever was behind her eyes. "Lady," he said. His voice had changed, the pleasantness entirely gone, something more honest in its place. "You don't want to do this." "I'm not doing anything yet," she said. "Leaving is also an option, a considerably better one." Another silence. Somewhere in the spruce trees above the cabin, a bird called once, twice. The man on the horse to her right moved first, a slight shift of weight, beginning the process of dismounting, and she swung the rifle toward him without taking it off the thin-faced man entirely, a motion that covered both and neither perfectly, and said very clearly, "Don't." He stopped. What happened next came from the tree line above the cabin. A sound first, a single, sharp whistle, the kind that carried specific information. Then Rhett came out of the spruce above the north end of the clearing, moving downhill fast, and he was not moving the way he moved around the homestead. He was moving the way something moves when it has identified a threat and is closing distance. He was also not alone, but that became apparent only after, when things had resolved enough to count details. He had a man with him, someone she didn't know, a broad figure in a dark coat who came out of the trees behind him and spread wide to cover the rider's exit trail. Rhett reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. He had his rifle up before he was fully out of the trees. "Eliza." He did not take his eyes off the riders. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "How long?" 10 minutes. He looked at the 4 men. He looked at the thin-faced man specifically, with an expression that was the most purely dangerous expression she had seen on his face, more dangerous than anything the riders had shown, which was saying something. It was not rage. It was something colder and more focused than rage. "You're on private land," Rhett said. "Armed, on private land, threatening my wife." He said this as a set of facts he was presenting for the record. "I know who sent you. Tell him, if any of you happen to speak to him again, that the next men he sends up here will not leave the same way they came." The thin-faced man looked at Rhett, looked at the man covering the exit trail, looked at Eliza on the porch with the rifle. "We were just," he started. "No," Rhett said. The single syllable closed the sentence absolutely. "Go." They went. She stood on the porch and watched them ride back up the trail and around the outcrop until the sounds of them faded into the general sound of the mountain. Her arms were shaking slightly, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the specific physical aftermath of sustained tension releasing, the body demanding acknowledgement of what the mind had held together. Rhett was there before she fully registered him coming across the clearing. He was in front of her, and he took the rifle from her hands, gently, the way he'd taken her hands in February, and set it against the porch rail. "You're shaking," he said. "I know." She pressed her hands against her thighs. "I'm fine." "I know you're fine." He said it immediately, without doubt in it, which was somehow exactly the right thing to say. She looked at him. He had come back a day early. She hadn't asked yet why. His face was still carrying the expression from the clearing or something close to it, and she understood that the flatness of it was not actually flatness. It was containment. He was containing something. "You were watching," she said. "From the trees." "I came up the back trail," he said, "saw their horses at the bottom, came up high, and came around." He paused. "I was going to move sooner, but you—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "You had it," he said. "So I waited." She looked at him. "You let me handle it." You were handling it. He met her eyes. I wasn't going to take that from you.
She thought about the woman who had stood in front of Silas Croft in October, the one who had said no with a steady voice while her insides were anything but steady. She thought about the months between then and now, and what those months had built in her, the specific weight and density of what she had become. He's not going to stop, she said. Croft.
No. Rhett picked up the rifle, checked it, set it safely. He won't stop because he can't afford to. That morning at the church, that was public. In front of the whole town. He came back to the porch. Men like Croft don't absorb that kind of thing and move on. Their power runs on reputation. We broke his. So what do? He was quiet for a moment. We finish it, he said. She looked at him. How? He looked out at the clearing, the trail where the 4 riders had been, the empty space they'd left. The man who came up with me, that's a deputy marshal. Name of Harding. He's been building a case against Croft for 2 years, fraud mostly, the way Croft's been running his lending operation. He looked at her. He needed testimony from people Croft had wronged, people who weren't afraid of him. She absorbed this. You went down to find the marshal. I went down to resupply. Finding Harding was something I'd been working toward for a while. He paused. I wasn't sure I could get him to come. He came. She looked at him. At the deliberateness of it. The quiet, long patience of a man who had spent 6 years learning to play long games because the mountain required it. How long have you been planning this? He thought about it. Since October, he said. Since the morning at the church, she understood. Since the gold on the church steps in Croft's face and the specific unfinished quality of that confrontation. He had paid the debt and taken her out of immediate danger and then, quietly, with no announcement, begun the process of making sure the danger didn't follow. You didn't tell me, she said. I didn't want to tell you something might happen and then have it not happen. He met her eyes. I didn't want to... He stopped, started again. I didn't want you to be waiting on it. She looked at him for a moment. She could feel the shape of what he wasn't saying, the specific way he protected people from contingencies that might not materialize, carrying the weight of the uncertain thing rather than distributing it. It was both admirable and infuriating, and she was too tired right now to land clearly on which one was dominant. Next time, she said, you tell me. He held her gaze. All right. I mean it, Rhett. I know you do. He said it quietly. Next time, I tell you. The man in the dark coat, Deputy Marshal Harding, came down from the tree line 10 minutes later, having apparently waited at a polite distance while this conversation resolved itself. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a gray-streaked mustache and the particular manner of a man who had spent a career reading situations and adjusting his entry into them accordingly. He nodded at Eliza with genuine respect rather than the performed kind. Mrs. Mercer, he said, that was well done. They weren't expecting to be face down, she said. No, he agreed. They weren't. He looked at Rhett. I got a good look at 2 of them. Croft's hired men. I know both names. This is what we needed. Will it be enough? Rhett said. Combined with the fraud documentation and the testimony from the Pattersons and the widow Keene, Harding pulled at his mustache. It'll be enough. The following morning, the deputy marshal rode back down the mountain with the names of the hired men, a written statement from Eliza regarding the confrontation, and a letter from Rhett to the county court attesting to a pattern of coercion and intimidation that Croft had exercised across the valley. Eliza had written her own portion of the statement herself, in full, without assistance. She had been precise and detailed, and she had not softened anything. She watched Harding's horse disappear down the trail. It'll take time, Rhett said. He was beside her. I know. Courts move slowly. I know that too. She looked at the trail. The morning was clear, genuinely, warmly clear in the way that only happened on the mountain after a long stretch of difficult weather, the sky a startling clean blue, and the snow on the peaks beginning to give at the edges. But it's moving. He nodded. She turned back to the homestead. There was always work. That was one of the constants of this life, the reliable pressure of necessary tasks. But she stopped at the porch steps and looked at the cabin, the barn, the woodpile that was lower now after the winter, but not dangerously so, The dock on the lake where the ice had broken up last week and the water was showing itself again, cold and green and deep. "I want to write to my mother," she said. "We can get a letter out with the next supply run." "I know." She looked at the lake. I want to tell her that things are different than I expected." She paused. "Not easier, but different." He said nothing, which was his way of listening. "I came up here because there was no other option," she said. "That was the truth in October. I didn't choose this, not really. I chose it over something worse, which isn't the same as choosing it." She looked at him. But now, he was watching her. His face was open in the particular way it occasionally opened. Not fully, not easily, but present. "Now I'd choose it," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. The lake moved slightly in a morning breeze. Somewhere above them a hawk described a slow, patient circle against the blue. "Eliza," he said. She looked at him. He reached out and took her hand. Not the careful, warming grip of February, not a practical gesture. Something more deliberate. He held her hand the way a man holds something he's decided to stop treating carelessly, and he looked at her with his gray eyes and his difficult-to-read face, which she could now read clearly, and what she read in it was the same thing she had been trying to find words for since approximately January. "I know," she said, before he could. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you were going to say." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Do you?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "And the answer is yes, whatever form the question takes." Something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not the ghost of a smile, not the compressed corner of his mouth that indicated private amusement. Something fuller than that. Something that cost him something to show, and that he showed anyway. He tightened his hand around hers. They stood on the porch in the spring morning, looking at the lake, at the peaks, at the enormous indifferent beauty of the place they had survived together. His hand was warm. Her hand was warm inside it. The mountain rose above them on all sides with its permanent, unconditional silence, and neither of them felt any need to fill it. Inside the cabin later, she sat down to write the letter to her mother. She had thought it would be difficult, finding the right words for something she hadn't yet fully organized in herself. But the words came without struggle, which surprised her. She wrote about the winter, about the work and the cold and the weight of the water buckets and the way she had learned to read the weather. She wrote about the trapline and the rifle and the morning in April when 4 men had come up the trail and gone back down it. She wrote about the way the lake looked when the ice broke up, the sound of it in the night, groaning and releasing, the sound of a winter letting go. She did not write about Rhett directly. Some things did not fit in letters. She wrote at the end, "I am not the person who left you in October. I am not sure I could explain adequately who I am now, except to say that I am not afraid of this life. I was afraid of it. I am not anymore. I think that is the most important thing I have to tell you." She folded the letter, held it in her hands for a moment. Outside, she could hear Rhett in the yard, the particular rhythm of him working, the sounds she had memorized through a winter without intending to, the crack of the axe on wood, the scrape of something being moved across the stone porch, the low, brief sound he made when a task completed itself to his satisfaction, which was not quite a sound at all, but she heard it anyway. She set the letter down, got up, went to the door. He was splitting wood in the yard, back to her, the afternoon light coming at an angle across the clearing and making the lake behind him look like hammered copper. He had taken off his coat. The work was moving through him in the particular efficient rhythm she knew as well as her own. She sat on the porch step and watched him work. He didn't acknowledge her immediately, but she saw the slight adjustment in his posture that meant he knew she was there. That was one of the things about this, the awareness they had developed of each other, the way the other person's presence registered without requiring announcement. After a while, he stopped, drove the axe into the splitting block, and turned. "Letter done?" he said. "Done." She looked at him. "Next supply run. We send it down." He nodded, picked up his coat, sat on the other end of the porch step. For a while they sat in the afternoon sun without speaking. The hawk was still up there, or a different one, she couldn't tell. The lake turned from copper to gold as the light continued its long afternoon movement. "Do you think it will stick?" she said. The case against Croft.
Harding's thorough, Rhett said, and Croft's made too many enemies. People were waiting for someone to move first. He looked at his hands. It'll stick. And then he's finished, he said. In the county, at least. A man like that, once the legal ground goes out from under him, he shook his head slightly. There's nothing left to stand on.
She thought about the morning at the church, the gold on the steps and the silence of 40 people who had expected to see something cruel and saw something else instead. She thought about Croft's face, the specific quality of his expression when that silence fell, the thing that happened to a man's power when it is publicly refused. It started there, she said, that morning. Yes, you knew it would. She looked at him. When you dumped that gold on the church steps, you knew what it would do to him. He was quiet for a moment. I knew it would make things complicated, he said. Public humiliation. Men like Croft don't set that down. He looked at the lake. But I also knew that leaving him with a quiet victory was worse. If you'd gone with him, or if your family had just lost the property quietly, he'd have just done it again, to someone else. He paused. The only thing that stops men like Croft is making it cost them in public. She thought about that, about the calculation of it, the way he had walked into that town and done the most visible possible thing, understanding the consequence and doing it anyway. That was brave, she said. What you did, whatever else it was. He looked at her sideways. I had a sack of gold and a plan, he said. That's less brave than it sounds. You had a plan that required you to walk into a town full of people who thought you were half savage, she said, and put yourself in the middle of it. He was quiet. Brave, she said again. He picked up a piece of wood that hadn't quite split clean, turned it in his hands. You faced down 4 armed men with an axe and a rifle you had to walk past them to get to, he said. That's a different word than brave. What word? He looked at her with his gray eyes, and she had been looking at those eyes for 6 months now. Through firelight and snowstorm and the long winter nights and the complicated mornings after, and she knew exactly what was in them. Mine, he said quietly. Not possessively, the other kind. The kind that means I know you, and I know what you're made of, and I'm not letting go of that. She held his gaze. The late afternoon sun was warm on the porch boards. The mountain was enormous around them, permanent and patient and entirely indifferent to the small, significant things happening at its base. Yours, she said. 3 weeks after Deputy Marshal Harding rode back down the mountain, a letter came up with the supply runner. Rhett had arranged this years ago. A young man named Cord Briggs, who made the run between the valley settlements and the high country trapping outposts twice monthly through the warmer seasons, carrying supplies and messages for a reasonable fee and without excessive curiosity about other people's business, which Rhett valued as much as the reliability. Cord was 19, gap-toothed, and had the particular toughness of someone who had grown up poor in hard country and decided early that complaining about it was a waste of energy he couldn't spare. He arrived on a Tuesday with flour, salt, lamp oil, and 2 letters. One was from Margaret Hartwell. Eliza read it on the porch, while Cord helped Rhett unload the pack horse, and she read it twice because the first time she went too fast, hungry for the specific texture of her mother's voice in the words. Margaret wrote the way she spoke, plain, without sentiment that didn't earn its place, with a dry humor that surfaced occasionally in the corners of sentences. She wrote that she had moved in with the Abbotts through the winter, which Eliza had not known, and which produced a complicated mixture of relief and guilt that she sat with honestly. She wrote that the town had been talking about Silas Croft, that things were shifting, that people who had been afraid to say certain things were beginning to say them. And at the end, in her mother's small, careful handwriting, I have been thinking about you on that mountain. Not worrying. I want to be clear about that distinction. Thinking. There is a version of you I imagined you would become, growing up in this valley, and then there is whatever you are becoming up there, which I suspect is considerably more interesting. Your father would have had opinions about all of this, most of them wrong, but delivered with great confidence. I miss him. I also miss you. Come down when you can. Bring the mountain man. I want to look at him properly. Eliza folded the letter, pressed it against her sternum for a moment. Good news? Rhett said. He had come up onto the porch,
Cord having apparently been sent off with payment and a meal. "My mother wants to meet you properly," she said. She used those exact words. Something moved through his expression. Properly. "She saw you for approximately 40 seconds in October before everything happened. She feels this was insufficient." Eliza looked at him. "She's not wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "The second letter," he said. He held it out. His face had gone carefully neutral in the way it went when he was managing something. She looked at the handwriting on the outside. She didn't recognize it. She took it, opened it. It was from Deputy Marshal Harding. She read it standing up because she could feel from the first line that sitting down would not be sufficient. Silas Croft had been arrested on the 14th of May. The charges were extensive: fraudulent lending practices, coercion, conspiracy to intimidate, and attached to the confrontation on the mountain, the additional charge of organizing armed trespass with criminal intent. Harding's letter was precise and detailed in the way of a man who understood that the people who had put themselves at risk deserved to know exactly what that risk had produced. The widow Keene had testified. The Patterson family had testified. Two of Croft's former employees, apparently having calculated that loyalty to a sinking man was a poor investment, had provided statements that corroborated the pattern of fraud across a dozen transactions. The court date was set for August. Harding did not predict the outcome with certainty. He was not that kind of man. But he wrote that the evidence was substantial and the mood in the county had changed in the months since October, and that Croft's particular brand of power depended on people believing it was permanent, and that belief was now comprehensively broken. At the bottom of the letter, in a different tone than the rest, "Mrs. Mercer, what you did on that mountain in April, facing those men alone, was the act that gave us the final piece we needed. Your written statement, combined with the identifications we were able to make, closed the last gap in the case. You should know that." She lowered the letter. Rhett was watching her. "It's done," she said. He read it when she handed it to him. She watched his face while he read, the careful stillness of it, the single slight compression around his eyes when he reached the part about the arrest. He read to the end, set the letter down on the porch rail. He was quiet for a long moment. The lake below them was the deep early summer green of cold water warming at the surface, and the afternoon light on it was the kind of light that made the world look like it was trying to explain something. 6 years, she said quietly. He looked at her. "You've been up here 6 years, she said. 2 of them with that man at the bottom of the mountain, knowing what he was and not having the ground to move from." She looked at him steadily. "That's over." He exhaled. It was not a dramatic thing, just a breath released with a slowness that told her it had been held for longer than one conversation. "Yes," he said. She went to him. She put her hand against the side of his face. Not gently, not tentatively, but with the directness that was how she did most things now. The directness the mountain had not given her exactly, but had permitted to surface. He turned into it slightly, the way a person turns toward warmth without deciding to. "It's over," she said again. Not for him this time. For both of them. He covered her hand with his. They stood there on the porch in the afternoon light, and the mountain held them in its enormous, indifferent patience, and it was not a perfect moment. The porch boards were uneven under their feet, and she had flour on her sleeve from the morning's baking, and somewhere behind them a horse was making a dissatisfied sound about something. But it was theirs, completely, in the way that only real things are. Then, because they were who they were, they went back to work. That was the summer Rhett was nearly killed by a mountain lion. He would object to that characterization, she knew, and object in the specific way he objected to things that were true but that he found overstated. A compression of the jaw, a flat look, a single counter-argument delivered without elaboration. But she had seen him come back through the cabin door on a Thursday evening in July, and she had seen his face and the way he was holding his left side, and she had made her own assessment of the situation. He had been on the trap line. The lion had apparently been denning in the area and had taken exception to the intrusion in the particular decisive manner of large predatory cats. He had gotten between it and what it wanted, and it had made its position clear before he could put enough distance between them. The injuries were to his left side and arm, 3 lacerations that were not life-threatening individually, but were collectively serious enough that she spent the next 2 hours using every piece of medical knowledge she had accumulated, and some she improvised. She did not panic.
She noted this about herself with the particular private satisfaction of someone who has learned something about their own capacity and is not going to make a speech about it. She was frightened. She was frightened in the way that fear actually works, not as paralysis, but as a sharpening, everything coming into focus. And she worked through that fear with the same logic he had taught her. Next thing, only the next thing. He sat at the table and let her work, which told her more about the seriousness of it than anything else. Rhett did not sit still and allow himself to be tended to under ordinary circumstances. He had the particular difficulty with vulnerability that belonged to people who had learned to manage everything alone for too long. "Hold still," she said, because he had shifted for the third time. "I'm holding still." "You moved."
I breathed, he said. Breathing involves movement. I maintain that this counts as holding still. It doesn't. She pressed the cloth more firmly against the deepest cut, and he went rigid and said nothing, which she took as cooperation. "How close was it?" "Close enough." "That's not an answer."
"It's the answer I have." He looked at the ceiling. His jaw was tight. "I heard it too late. I was moving into the wind, and the sound was wrong." A pause. "I got turned around in time, but not fast enough." She worked in silence for a while. The lamp was bright on the table between them. Outside, the summer dark was full of the sounds it was full of. The creek, the wind in the spruce, the occasional call of something she could now identify, rather than simply fear. "You could have been killed," she said. "I could have been," he agreed. Does it not?" She stopped. Started again. "Does that not register for you? The possibility of it?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasively, thinking. "It registers," he said. "I'm not reckless about it." He looked at her then, turning his head carefully. "It registers differently now than it used to." She met his eyes. "Used to be," he said, "if the lion had won, the main consequence would have been that the trapline went unchecked for the season." He said it without self-pity, as fact. "Now there's more consequence than that." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "There is." She finished cleaning and binding the wounds with a thoroughness that he didn't argue with, which meant it hurt enough that argument required energy he didn't have. She made him drink the broth she had on the fire. She did not fuss. She was not built for fussing, and he would not have tolerated it. But she stayed at the table with him while he ate, and when he was done, she said, "Sleep in the main room tonight. I want to hear you if something changes." He looked at her. "I'll be fine." "I know you'll be fine. Sleep in the main room." He slept in the main room. She lay in her bed and listened to his breathing through the thin partition wall, the same wall she had listened through all winter, the sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. And she thought about consequence, about how he had used that word, about the years he had spent on this mountain without anyone for whom his survival was a consequence, and what it meant that this had changed, and what it had cost both of them to build the thing that made it true. She thought about a girl of 20 who had stood in a church in October with flowers still dried on her hands from unfinished bread dough, saying words to a stranger because there was no better option. She thought about everything between that morning and this one, the weight of the water buckets, and the cold that stayed in the bones, and the argument in February, and the letters, and the 4 riders, and Harding's letter on the porch rail, and Rhett's hand covering hers. None of it had been what she'd have chosen, if choosing from comfort. But she had not been choosing from comfort. She had been choosing from the edge of things, which is where the real choices live. Not the easy ones, not the ones that cost nothing, but the ones that cost everything and therefore mean something. She fell asleep listening to him breathe on the other side of the wall. He healed because he was constitutionally difficult to stop. He was back on the trap line in 10 days, which was too soon by her assessment, and precisely when he had determined it was necessary by his. They did not argue about this because she had said her piece clearly once and he had heard it, and repeating it would not have changed his calculation and would have changed the quality of the air between them, and she valued the quality of the air between them enough to pick her fights carefully. What she did instead was go with him. He looked at her when she appeared at the barn door with her rifle in her coat. That first morning he declared himself fit to return to the line. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. "I want to know the full line. Not the section you've shown me. All of it." He held her gaze for a moment. "It's a long day. I'm aware of what a long day is." A pause.
Then he handed her the pack he'd been about to put on his own back. "Carry this, then." She took it.
They did the full trap line together that day, and she paid attention to everything: the placement logic, the terrain reading, the way he moved through the country, the things he checked without appearing to check them. It was a long day. Her legs ached by mid-afternoon, and she said nothing about it. At the turnaround point, the highest part of the line where the terrain opened up into a broad rock plateau, and the view was the kind that still did what it had always done to her, she stopped. He stopped too. Let her look. "When my mother comes up," she said, "I'm bringing her here." He looked at her sideways. "Your mother's going to make that climb." "She absolutely is." Eliza looked at the mountains ranged around them, the distances, the silence. "She's tougher than she looks. She just never had reason to show it." He was quiet for a moment. "Like someone else I know." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the view, not at her, but the corner of his mouth had done the thing. She had come to love that thing. The compressed almost smile that he deployed when something landed true, and he didn't have a way to say it that didn't feel like too much. She didn't say anything. She looked at the view with him. August arrived, and with it, the news from the county court. Cord Briggs brought it on a Monday, along with a copy of the Caldwell Creek Gazette that someone had sent up. She thought it might have been Harding, though the package was unmarked. The headline was not subtle. Croft had been convicted on 7 of the 9 charges. The sentencing was substantial. The Gazette's account was written in the breathless style of a small-town paper encountering the biggest story it had seen in a decade. And she read it at the kitchen table with Rhett across from her, reading over her arm, and when she reached the paragraph where the judge's statement was quoted, "A sharp public denunciation of the exploitation of vulnerable families under the guise of legitimate commerce," she stopped and read it again. "It says the case was brought substantially on evidence from a mountain homestead above the valley," she said. "Yes." "It says armed men were dispatched to intimidate witnesses." She looked up. "We're witnesses." "We are." "It says the intimidation failed." She looked at the paper. "It doesn't say why it failed." "No," he said. "It doesn't need to." She set the paper down, looked at it, then she looked at him. "It's really over." "It's over." She sat with that. Really sat with it. Gave it the space it deserved. 7 months. 7 months since a Tuesday morning when the richest and cruelest man in Caldwell Creek had stood in her mother's front room with his pressed coat and his receding jaw and his smile, and told her that her family's entire existence could be reduced to a number and a deadline. 7 months since she had said no in a church doorway. 7 months since gold had spilled across worn church boards and a gray-eyed stranger had held out his hand. She reached across the table and took Rhett's hand. He turned it over and held hers properly. "I want to go down," she said, "to see my mother, before summer's fully gone." "We can go next week," he said. "Weather's holding." "Both of us." He looked at her. A slight hesitation. She felt it in his hand, the old pull of a man who had spent 6 years finding the world below the mountain uncomfortable and had reasons for that discomfort that were not irrational. Then he said, "Both of us." They rode down the mountain on a Wednesday, the 3rd week of August, on a morning when the high country was still cool but the valley below them was green and warm, the aspens not yet turned, the summer holding its last weeks with the particular determination of a good thing unwilling to go. The trail down was different than the trail up had been. She knew it now. Every switchback, every loose shale section, every place where the view opened up, and every place where the trees closed in. She had ridden it in both directions enough times through the warmer months that it had become hers in the way that learned things become yours, not owned, but known. Rhett rode beside her where the trail was wide enough, and behind her where it wasn't, and she could feel him watching the country around them with the attention he always gave it. Not anxious, just present. The way he was present in everything. Caldwell Creek looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing. She had been in it her whole life and never noticed its smallness. It had simply been the world, the size of the world. Now she could see it whole, the single main street, the 30-odd buildings, the church where she had said words to a stranger, the land office where the foreclosure notice had been posted, the bank where Pettigrew had told her she had no collateral, all of it fitting into a space that the mountain would have swallowed without noticing. People stared. She had expected that. She found she did not care about it the way she might have in October. The stairs had weight then, had the weight of judgment and expectation, and everyone knowing everything about everyone in the airless way of small communities. Now they were just people looking at something that surprised them. She could look back. Her mother was waiting outside the house. Margaret Hartwell had apparently received the letter she'd sent down with Cord, and had apparently taken it seriously, and was standing in the yard when they came down the road with the composed alertness of a woman who has been watching for something and is managing her reaction to seeing it arrive. She looked at Eliza first, the long, comprehensive look of a mother taking inventory of a child she hasn't seen in months. And Eliza watched her mother's face do its quiet, careful work of absorbing what she saw. Then Margaret looked at Rhett. He dismounted. He was not comfortable in towns, she knew, and he was particularly not comfortable being looked at. And being looked at by her mother was a specific variety of being looked at that she could tell was requiring some active management on his part. He stood beside his horse and met Margaret's gaze with the flat directness that was simply how he was. Her mother walked toward him, stopped in front of him. She came up to his shoulder. She said, "You brought her back down in one piece." "She'd argue with the framing," he said. Something moved through her mother's expression. "She would," she said. "She gets that from her father." A pause. "Thank you." He nodded once, the nod she knew. Then Margaret turned to Eliza, and whatever careful composure she had been maintaining became irrelevant, and they held each other in the yard in the August warmth, and neither of them said anything for a while because neither of them needed to. They stayed 2 days. The town was different, or her perception of it was, which amounted to the same thing. The Croft matter had shifted things. Deputy Marshal Harding had been thorough, and the people who had spent years afraid to say what they knew had now said it publicly, and the relief of that had changed the atmosphere in the particular way that relief changes atmospheres, not into happiness exactly, but into a lighter quality of air, a sense that the weight that everyone had been collectively pretending not to carry had been set down. People spoke to her, some of them with the slight awkwardness of people who had watched her leave and were not entirely sure of the terms on which they were meeting her now. Some of them, the widow Keene, old Tom Abbott, with a warmth that was uncomplicated and genuine. The widow Keene pressed her hands and said simply, "Your testimony mattered. You should know that." Eliza said, "So did yours." Rhett moved through the 2 days with the contained endurance of a man fulfilling a commitment he had made and intended to see through properly. He was not miserable exactly, but he was counting. She could see him counting. On the morning they left, she watched him saddle the horses in her mother's small yard, and she thought about what it had cost him, this man who was constitutionally, essentially, a creature of the high country, to come down and put himself in the middle of other people's spaces and other people's eyes for 2 days, because she had asked him to. Not because the mountain required it, not because it was practical, because she had said she wanted it. She thought, this is what love actually is, not the easy thing, not the accommodation that costs nothing, the kind that involves going somewhere uncomfortable because the other person needs you there. She went to him. He was tightening the cinch on the bay. "Ready?" he said. "Rhett?" He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for coming down." He looked at her for a moment with his gray eyes, in the August morning light, in the yard of her mother's house, in the town where they had made an impossible deal on a Tuesday in October, and neither of them had known what they were actually agreeing to. "Don't thank me," he said. "It's what you do." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You go where the other person needs you," he said, simply, without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered. "That's what you do." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and mounted, and they said goodbye to her mother, who held Eliza tight, and then, to everyone's mild surprise, patted Rhett once on the arm with a firmness that was its own form of acceptance, and they rode north, up out of the valley, onto the trail that had become theirs. The mountain came back to them gradually, the way it always did. The altitude first, then the trees, then the silence that was not emptiness but fullness of a different kind. By the time they reached the high country, and the lake came into view below the ridge, she felt the thing she felt every time she came back to it. Not relief exactly, but recognition. The specific ease of arriving somewhere that knows you. Rhett pulled up at the overlook above the homestead, the place where she had stopped on the second day of the ride up, and been unable to speak for a moment at the scale of it. They both stopped here now, without having agreed to, the way they did most things. The lake was deep blue in the afternoon. The cabin was there, solid and weathered, the woodpile in need of restocking for the coming winter. The smoke from the banked fire they'd left going was a thin gray thread against the spruce. "It needs work," Rhett said, meaning the woodpile. "It always needs work," she said. We'll start tomorrow." "Yes, Tom. Sis," she said. "We will." She looked at it. All of it. The homestead, and the lake, and the mountains rising behind. The enormous, patient country that had taken everything she thought she was and subjected it to conditions that were honest in the way that very few things are honest, and given back something harder and truer and more her own. She had come up this trail terrified, with nothing. She was going back down it someday. She knew that. They both knew that. The mountain was not a forever place for most people, even when it was a long-time place. But she was going down as someone who had been forged rather than broken, and the difference between those two things was everything. She had learned this the hard way, which is the only way the real things get learned. That strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it. That trust is not given, it is built, slowly, in the specific currency of small true actions over time. That two people becoming a unit is not a romantic notion, but a practical one, earned through the particular unglamorous work of choosing, repeatedly, to show up for each other in the hard moments and the ordinary ones with equal commitment. And she had learned, perhaps most importantly, most privately, that the life you fall into by necessity can become the life you would choose by intention if you do the work of meeting it honestly. The hawk was there again, or one like it, describing its patient circle above the ridge. "Home," she said. Rhett looked at her. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but she held it. It was true. "Home," he said. They rode down to it together, into the long gold afternoon of the last good weeks, before the mountain began its preparations again. The horses steady on the familiar trail, the water bright below them, the enormous silence holding them both in its impersonal and absolute embrace. The silence of a place that does not care whether you survive it, but offers everything you need if you're willing to learn how. They were willing. That had always been the thing.